The federal courtroom fell silent as Judge Edward Chen leaned forward, his black robe draped over his tall frame, eyes fixed on the young congresswoman standing before him. Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th District, had just begun her testimony about voting rights violations when the judge raised his hand sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. What happened next would send shockwaves through Washington and become the most viral courtroom moment of the year. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the latest political drama that's shaking up America. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in San Francisco's federal courthouse, where Judge Edward Chen presided over a high-stakes hearing on voting rights legislation. The 8-year-old judge, appointed by President Obama in 2011, was known for his no-nonsense approach and his tendency to shut down witnesses he deemed unprepared or off-topic. His courtroom was his kingdom, and few dared to challenge his authority. Representative Jasmine Crockett had traveled all the way from Texas to provide expert testimony. At 42 years old, the former civil rights attorney had become one of the most outspoken voices in Congress, known for her sharp wit and her refusal to back down from anyone. Dressed in a burgundy blazer with her signature gold hoop earrings, she carried a thick binder of evidence under her arm as she approached the witness stand. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Attorneys from the Department of Justice sat on one side, their faces stern and focused. On the other side, representatives from several southern states waited, ready to defend their controversial voting laws. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and legal observers, all sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Judge Chen's voice boomed across the courtroom as he swore in Representative Crockett. His tone was clipped and businesslike, leaving no room for small talk or pleasantries. Crockett placed her hand on the Bible, took the oath, and settled into the witness chair with the confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms before ever stepping foot in Congress. Representative Crockett, the judge began, peering over his reading glasses, please confine your testimony to matters directly relevant to the constitutional questions before this court. We don't have time for political speeches. The implied insult hung in the air. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Crockett, however, simply nodded and opened her binder with deliberate slowness, a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips. She had dealt with condescension her entire career, and she wasn't about to let it intimidate her now. Your Honor, she replied smoothly, her Texas accent becoming more pronounced. I practiced law for over a decade before I was elected to Congress. I understand the difference between legal testimony and political rhetoric. What I'm about to share with this court is documentation of systematic voter suppression that violates the 14th and 15th Amendments. Judge Chen's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to witnesses pushing back, even politely. But before he could respond, Crockett continued, pulling out a stack of documents from her binder. In fact, Your Honor, I brought copies of 47 sworn affidavits from voters in my district, who were turned away from polling places despite being registered. I also have statistical analysis from 3 independent research firms showing that polling place closures in Texas have disproportionately affected communities of color by a ratio of 6-to-1. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. This wasn't going the way he had expected. Most witnesses became flustered or overly deferential when challenged from the bench. But Representative Crockett seemed to be gaining confidence with each passing moment, her voice growing, stronger and more assured. Representative, Judge Chen interrupted, his voice taking on a sharper edge, I'm familiar with what affidavits are. What I'm questioning is whether your testimony will add anything substantive to what has already been submitted to this court in written form. Perhaps it would be more efficient if we simply entered your documents into evidence without taking up the court's time with oral testimony. It was a clear dismissal, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Several reporters began typing furiously on their laptops. The DOJ attorneys exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. A federal judge was essentially trying to prevent a sitting member of Congress from testifying in a case that directly affected her constituents. But if Judge Chen thought Jasmine Crockett would simply accept his brush off and take her seat, he had severely underestimated the woman standing before him. The Congresswoman straightened her shoulders, looked the judge directly in the eye, and delivered a response that would be replayed on every news network for the next 48 hours. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but unwavering, the people I represent didn't send me here to submit paperwork and walk away. They sent me here to use my voice because theirs have been silenced. And while I understand this is your courtroom, this is still America, where even a black woman from Texas has the right to speak truth to power. whether that power comes from state legislatures or federal judges. The courtroom erupted. Not with noise, but with the kind of electric silence that comes when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something historic. Judge Chen's face went through a remarkable transformation, from irritation to shock to something that looked almost like respect. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For perhaps the first time in his lengthy judicial career, Edward Chen appeared to be at a complete loss for words. To understand why this moment was so significant, you need to know Jasmine Crockett's backstory. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, she grew up watching her grandmother fight for civil rights in a time when speaking up could cost you everything. Her grandmother's stories of sitting at segregated lunch counters and facing down violent opposition to voting rights shaped young Jasmine's understanding of justice from an early age. After earning her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center, Crockett built a reputation as a fierce civil rights attorney. She didn't take high-paying corporate cases. Instead, she represented people who had been wrongfully convicted, families fighting police brutality, and communities facing discrimination. Her courtroom skills became legendary in legal circles across Texas. One case in particular defined her career trajectory. In 2018, she represented a grandmother who had been purged from voter rolls despite living in the same house for 40 years. The case revealed systematic problems with Texas's voter registration system, affecting thousands of eligible voters. Crockett didn't just win the case, she turned it into a crusade, working with community organizations to help people re-register and testifying before the state legislature about the flaws in the system. Her passion for voting rights eventually led her to run for office herself. In 2020, she won a seat in the Texas House of Representatives, where she quickly made a name for herself by fearlessly challenging the Republican majority on voter suppression bills. When her congressional district opened up in 2022, she ran and won, becoming one of the youngest black women ever elected to represent Texas in Washington. But Congress didn't mellow Jasmine Crockett. If anything, it sharpened her edge. She gained national attention during heated committee hearings where she would dismantle bad faith arguments with surgical precision. Her social media presence exploded, with millions following her for her no-nonsense approach to politics and her ability to explain complex legal issues in plain language. Judge Edward Chen came from a very different background. The son of Chinese immigrants, he grew up in Philadelphia and experienced discrimination firsthand. His parents ran a small grocery store and worked 7 days a week to put him through school. Chen excelled academically, earning his law degree from the University of California, Berkeley, where he was at the top of his class. Before his appointment to the federal bench, Chen worked for decades as a civil rights attorney, focusing on cases involving discrimination against Asian Americans. He had a reputation as a progressive champion who fought against racial profiling and defended immigrant rights. His confirmation to the federal bench in 2011 was celebrated by civil rights organizations across the country. However, something changed when Chen donned the black robe. The passionate advocate became the stern judge. Some lawyers who had worked with him before his appointment said he seemed to overcompensate for his progressive background by being extra strict, as if to prove he could be impartial. Others suggested that the weight of the position and the lifetime appointment made him more conservative and protective of judicial authority. By the time Representative Crockett stood before him, Judge Chen had developed a reputation for running his courtroom with an iron fist. He frequently interrupted attorneys' limited witness testimony and had little patience for what he deemed unnecessary arguments. Some called him efficient, others called him imperious. What nobody disputed was that he expected complete deference to his authority. The case that brought these two formidable personalities into collision was about far more than courtroom procedure. At its heart was a fundamental question about American democracy. Should states have the right to make it harder for certain people to vote? After the Supreme Court gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, states across the South passed new voting restrictions at a pace not seen since the Jim Crow era. Texas led the charge with a series of laws that civil rights advocates argued were deliberately designed to suppress minority turnout. The restrictions included strict photo ID requirements that disproportionately affected elderly voters and people of color, closure of hundreds of polling places in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, reduction of early voting hours in urban areas while expanding them in suburban white communities, aggressive purging of voter rolls that removed thousands of legitimate voters, ban on drive-through voting, which had been used successfully during the pandemic. The Department of Justice filed a lawsuit arguing these measures violated the Constitution. But lawsuits move slowly, and in the meantime, Real people were being denied their fundamental right to vote. That's where Representative Crockett came in. She had personally witnessed the impact of these laws in her district and could provide testimony that went beyond statistics and legal arguments. She had stories like Mrs. Jefferson, an 82-year-old grandmother who had voted in every election since 1964 but was turned away because her driver's license had expired and she couldn't afford the $35 fee for a voter ID. Or Marcus Williams, a college student who found his polling place had been moved 15 miles away from campus with no public transportation to get there. These were real Americans whose voices were being silenced, and Crockett was determined to be heard on their behalf. But to Judge Chen, who had grown comfortable in his position of power and perhaps disconnected from the street-level reality of voter suppression, Crockett's testimony seemed like political grandstanding. He wanted to move through his docket efficiently, not listen to stories and anecdotes. That fundamental disconnect between the judge's desire for procedural efficiency and the Congresswoman's determination to speak for her constituents set the stage for an explosive confrontation. After Crockett's powerful rebuke about speaking truth to power, the courtroom remained in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 10 seconds. Judge Chen's face had gone from pale to slightly flushed. His hands gripped the edge of the bench, and those who knew him well could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. He had two choices. He could acknowledge the validity of her point and allow her to testify fully, or he could dig in and reassert his authority. Unfortunately for everyone in that courtroom, Judge Chen chose the latter. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice now noticeably colder, "I appreciate your passion, but this court will not be lectured about American democracy or anyone's right to speak. You will answer questions posed to you by counsel in a direct and concise manner, or you will be excused. Do I make myself clear?" The threat was unmistakable. If Crockett continued to push back, the judge would remove her from the witness stand, effectively silencing the very person who had traveled 1,700 miles to give voice to the voiceless. The DOJ attorney representing the government's case shifted uncomfortably. This was going sideways fast, and losing Crockett's testimony could seriously weaken their case. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come this far to be intimidated. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was even steadier than before. "Your Honor, I hear you very clearly. And I want to assure you that I intend to answer every question posed to me directly and concisely. But I also want to remind this court that when the DOJ attorney asks me about the impact of these voting restrictions, my direct and concise answer will include the names and stories of real people who have been disenfranchised. Because that's not political rhetoric, that's evidence. That's fact, and that's exactly what this court needs to hear to make an informed decision." Someone in the gallery actually gasped. A few reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the court stenographer looked up from her machine, momentarily distracted from her job. Crockett had essentially told the judge that she would comply with his instructions, but only because what she was going to say happened to align with what he demanded. She had managed to submit to his authority while simultaneously asserting her own. Before Judge Chen could formulate his response, the DOJ attorney, Sandra Martinez, stood up. A veteran litigator with 20 years of civil rights experience, Martinez had been watching this exchange with growing concern. She knew she had to intervene before the judge made a decision he might later regret. "Your Honor, if I may," Martinez began, her voice respectful but firm, "Representative Crockett is here as an expert witness on voting rights implementation in Texas. Her testimony is crucial to establishing the real-world impact of the challenged legislation. While I understand the court's desire for efficiency, cutting short her testimony could create grounds for appeal and potentially undermine the integrity of these proceedings." It was a brilliant move. Martinez wasn't challenging the judge's authority directly. Instead, she was appealing to his legal mind, suggesting that his own actions might create reversible error. No judge wants their decision overturned on appeal, especially not on procedural grounds that could be portrayed as judicial overreach. Judge Chen's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't considered the appellate implications of shutting down a congressional witness. The defense attorneys, representing the state of Texas, sensed an opportunity. "Your Honor," one of them stood, a silver-haired man named Preston Burke, "the state would actually welcome Representative Crockett's full testimony. We have significant cross-examination prepared, and we're confident that her statements will actually support our position, that Texas's voting regulations are both constitutional and necessary." It was a calculated gamble by the defense. By welcoming Crockett's testimony, they were making themselves look confident and reasonable, while simultaneously boxing the judge into a corner. How could he justify limiting her testimony if both sides wanted to hear it? Judge Chen sat back in his chair, and for a moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Everyone waited to see what he would do. His pride clearly wanted to put this uppity congresswoman in her place, but his legal training was telling him that might not be the smartest move. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully measured. "Very well, the witness may provide her testimony, however I expect focused responses to the questions asked. This is not a campaign rally, and I will not hesitate to strike testimony that veers into inappropriate political commentary. Miss Martinez, you may proceed with your examination." It wasn't exactly a gracious concession, but it was a concession nonetheless. Crockett had won the first major battle. She gave a slight nod to the judge, acknowledging his decision without appearing triumphant. She understood that she still had to walk a fine line if she wanted her testimony to be effective. What followed was nearly 90 minutes of some of the most powerful testimony the courtroom had heard in years. Martinez guided Crockett through a systematic presentation of the evidence, and true to her word, Crockett was both direct and devastating. She explained how polling place closures worked like a precision weapon, targeting communities with mathematical accuracy. She presented data showing that in counties where Black and Latino voters made up more than 70% of the population, polling locations had been reduced by an average of 42%. Meanwhile, in predominantly white suburban counties, the number of polling places had actually increased by 12%. But more importantly, she told the human stories behind the statistics. She described Mrs. Jefferson, the 82-year-old grandmother who had cried in her office after being turned away from voting. She talked about Marcus Williams, the college student who had to choose between taking his midterm exam and standing in line for 5 hours to vote. She presented the case of a single mother of 3 who lost her job because she missed work trying to get the required voter ID. Throughout her testimony, Judge Chen remained mostly silent, though those watching him closely noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. His jaw was less tight, his posture had relaxed slightly, and once or twice, when Crockett described particularly egregious cases, something that looked like concern flickered across his features. When Martinez finished her direct examination, Attorney Preston Burke rose for cross-examination. He was known as a skilled litigator, someone who could take apart witnesses with surgical precision. The gallery leaned forward, anticipating fireworks. "Representative Crockett," Burke began, his voice smooth and condescending, "you've shared some very moving stories. But isn't it true that you can't actually prove that any of these individuals were prevented from voting due to discrimination, rather than their own failure to follow simple, reasonable procedures?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Mr. Burke, with all due respect, when an 82-year-old woman who has voted in every election for 60 years is suddenly told she can't vote because of a photo ID law that didn't exist for 59 of those years, and when data shows that similar situations are happening 6 times more often in Black and Latino communities than in white communities, that's not failure to follow procedures. That's systematic disenfranchisement dressed up in neutral language." Burke tried several more approaches, but each time Crockett had a measured, fact-based response. She didn't get defensive or emotional. Even when Burke's questions became more pointed and aggressive, she simply met him with data, legal precedent, and common sense. At one point, Burke made what he thought was a clever move. "Representative, you keep talking about these voting restrictions affecting minority communities. But aren't you really just upset that these laws might reduce Democratic voter turnout and hurt your party's chances in future elections?" Before Crockett could answer, Judge Chen himself intervened. "Mr. Burke, that question is improper and will be stricken from the record. This witness's party affiliation is irrelevant to the constitutional questions before this court. Counsel will confine his cross-examination to the substance of the witness's testimony." It was a remarkable moment. The judge, who had tried to shut down Crockett's testimony at the start, was now protecting her from improper questioning. Something had shifted during her testimony. Perhaps her combination of legal expertise, personal experience, and genuine passion had reminded Judge Chen why he had become a civil rights attorney in the first place, before the weight of judicial robes had made him more concerned with procedure than justice. After nearly 3 hours of testimony and cross-examination, Judge Chen called for a brief recess. When everyone returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. The judge seemed different somehow, less rigid, more contemplative. The lawyers on both sides sensed it too. "Representative Crockett," Judge Chen said as the proceedings resumed, his voice noticeably softer than it had been at the start. "Before you're excused, I have a few questions for you myself." This was unusual but not unprecedented. Federal judges can ask clarifying questions of witnesses, though they typically do so sparingly, to maintain the appearance of impartiality. The courtroom went completely silent as everyone waited to see where this was going. "You mentioned earlier that your grandmother was involved in the civil rights movement. Can you tell me more about that?" The question caught everyone off guard, including Crockett. But she recognized it for what it was, a genuine inquiry from someone who wanted to understand, not score points. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "My grandmother was one of the Little Rock Nine supporters. She wasn't one of the students who integrated Central High School. But she was part of the community that protected them, that walked with them, that made sure they weren't alone when angry mobs gathered. Later, she spent years doing voter registration drives across the South. She told me stories about being threatened, about having rocks thrown at her, about watching friends get arrested for trying to help people register to vote. She said the hardest part wasn't the violence. It was the laws, the literacy tests, the poll taxes, the grandfather clauses, all these neutral-sounding rules that everyone knew were designed to keep black people from voting." Judge Chen listened intently, and those sitting close enough could see his eyes had become slightly glassy. "And what did your grandmother say when you told her you were becoming a lawyer?" he asked quietly. "She cried," Crockett said, her own voice catching slightly. "She said, 'Baby, we marched so you could do this. We got beat, we got arrested, we lost jobs and friends and sometimes our lives, all so that one day, someone like you could stand in a courtroom and be heard. Don't you ever forget that your voice carries all of our voices with you. That's why I couldn't stay quiet when you suggested I should just submit documents and leave, Your Honor. With respect, my grandmother didn't face down Bull Connor and fire hoses so that decades later, her granddaughter would be told to sit down and be quiet in a federal courtroom when black and brown people are losing their right to vote, all over again." The silence in the courtroom was profound. Several people in the gallery were wiping their eyes. Even some of the defense attorneys looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware of the weight of history bearing down on this moment. Judge Chen removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "My father came to this country from China in 1952. He couldn't vote for years because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. When that was finally repealed, and he became a citizen, he voted in every single election until the day he died. He used to tell me that voting was the most American thing a person could do because it meant you had a voice, that you mattered, that you were equal. When I became a civil rights attorney, I thought I was fighting that same fight, making sure everyone's voice was heard. And when I became a judge, I told myself I was still serving that cause, just from a different position." He paused, looking directly at Crockett. "But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot something important. I got so focused on managing my docket efficiently, on maintaining order in my courtroom, on following procedure, that I stopped seeing the people behind the cases. I stopped hearing the voices that needed to be heard. Representative Crockett, I owe you an apology. You came here today prepared to provide crucial testimony about voting rights violations affecting your constituents, and my first instinct was to silence you in the name of efficiency. That was wrong. And I'm grateful that you had the courage to push back, to remind me, to remind all of us in this courtroom what this case is really about." The courtroom was in shock. Federal judges almost never apologized to anyone, let alone to a witness they had just clashed with publicly. But Judge Chen wasn't finished. "This court will take the testimony we've heard today very seriously. Representative Crockett, your expertise as both an attorney and as someone who represents the affected communities directly is exactly what this court needed to hear. Thank you for your service, both to your constituents and to this court." As Representative Crockett stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained absolutely silent for a moment. Then, something unprecedented happened. One person in the gallery began to clap, then another. Within seconds, nearly half the courtroom was applauding. Judge Chen didn't stop it immediately, as he normally would have. He let it continue for nearly 10 seconds before gently rapping his gavel. "Order, please," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. "We still have a hearing to complete." As Crockett returned to her seat, the DOJ attorney Sandra Martinez leaned over and whispered, "That was extraordinary. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that." Even the defense attorney Preston Burke seemed affected. As the hearing continued with other witnesses, he was noticeably less aggressive, his questions more measured and respectful. But the most remarkable change was in Judge Chen himself. For the rest of the day, he seemed like a different person. He listened more carefully to testimony. He asked thoughtful questions. He showed patience with witnesses who struggled to express themselves clearly. It was as if Representative Crockett's willingness to stand up to him had reminded him of who he used to be, before the weight of judicial authority had turned him into someone more concerned with power than justice. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, video clips of the exchange between Judge Chen and Representative Crockett began circulating on social media. Someone in the courtroom had managed to record audio on their phone, and while the quality wasn't perfect, it captured every crucial moment. The hashtag number, Crockett vs. Chen, started trending on Twitter within 3 hours. By the next morning, it had been shared over 500,000 times. Major news networks picked up the story, with CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News running segments about the confrontation and the judge's remarkable apology. Political commentators across the spectrum praised Crockett's courage. Even some conservative voices who disagreed with her politics acknowledged her skill in standing up to judicial authority without being disrespectful. "What Representative Crockett did was remarkable," said one legal analyst on MSNBC. "She challenged a federal judge's authority without undermining the legitimacy of the court. She was firm but respectful, passionate but precise. It's a master class in how to speak truth to power." Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, who often criticized progressive Democrats, tweeted, "Disagree with Crockett's politics all you want, but her testimony was legally sound and personally powerful." Judge Chen was right to apologize. Late-night talk show hosts had a field day with the story. Stephen Colbert did an entire segment praising both Crockett's courage and Chen's humility. Trevor Noah dedicated significant time on The Daily Show to discussing the broader implications of the case. But the most impactful response came from regular Americans who shared the clips and expressed their own experiences with voter suppression. The comments sections filled with personal stories that echoed what Crockett had described in her testimony. 3 months after that dramatic hearing, Judge Edward Chen issued his ruling in the case. In a 127-page opinion, he struck down multiple provisions of Texas's voting restrictions as unconstitutional violations of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The opinion was remarkable not just for its legal reasoning but for its acknowledgement of the human impact of voter suppression. Judge Chen quoted extensively from Representative Crockett's testimony, including the stories of individual voters who had been disenfranchised. In one particularly powerful section, he wrote, "The right to vote is not merely a procedural formality, it is the bedrock upon which our democracy stands. When an 82-year-old woman who has participated in every election for 6 decades is suddenly told she cannot vote because of new ID requirements she cannot afford to meet, that is not merely an inconvenience. It is the denial of a fundamental constitutional right." This court has heard testimony from experts, reviewed statistical analyses, and examined legislative history. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Representative Jasmine Crockett, who provided both legal expertise and first-hand accounts of how these restrictions operate in practice. Her testimony made clear what the data suggested. These laws have a disparate impact on minority communities that cannot be justified by any legitimate state interest. The decision was immediately appealed by the state of Texas, but its impact was felt across the country. Voting rights advocates in other states began using Judge Chen's opinion as a template for challenging similar restrictions. Within a year, federal courts in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona had cited his decision in striking down their own voter suppression laws. The confrontation between Judge Chen and Representative Crockett resonated far beyond the specific case at hand. It became a touchstone for broader conversations about power, race, justice, and democracy in America. Law schools across the country began using the exchange as a teaching tool. Students studied how Crockett managed to challenge judicial authority while remaining within the bounds of proper courtroom decorum. They analyzed Judge Chen's transformation from antagonist to ally as a lesson in judicial humility and the importance of remaining open to being wrong. Civil rights organizations pointed to the incident as proof that personal courage still matters in the fight for justice. Representative Crockett became a sought-after speaker, traveling to college campuses and community groups to talk about the importance of speaking up even when it's uncomfortable or risky. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Judge Chen himself. In interviews following the case, he spoke candidly about how the experience had changed him. "Representative Crockett reminded me why I went to law school in the first place," he told a reporter from the New York Times. "Somewhere along the way, I had become more concerned with maintaining order than with seeking justice. I had forgotten that sometimes the most respectful thing we can do in a courtroom is to truly listen, especially when what we're hearing makes us uncomfortable." Colleagues noted a change in how Chen ran his courtroom after that day. He was still efficient and professional, but he showed more patience with witnesses and attorneys. He asked more questions designed to understand, rather than to control. And most notably, he began actively working with civil rights organizations to improve access to justice. Representative Jasmine Crockett's star continued to rise after the hearing. She was appointed to the House Judiciary Committee, where she quickly became one of its most visible and effective members. Her social media following exploded to over 5 million across all platforms, making her one of the most influential voices in progressive politics. But despite her growing national profile, Crockett remained focused on the work that had brought her to Congress in the first place, fighting for voting rights and criminal justice reform. She introduced comprehensive voting rights legislation that gained bipartisan support, a rare achievement in the polarized political environment. Judge Edward Chen continued serving on the federal bench, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He began teaching seminars at local law schools about judicial humility and the importance of remaining connected to the human impact of judicial decisions. He also started writing opinion pieces about the need for reform in how judges are trained and evaluated. In a remarkable development, Chen and Crockett developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect. When a major civil rights conference invited them both to speak about their courtroom exchange, they agreed to appear together in a panel discussion. Their honest conversation about power, justice, and the courage to change one's mind became one of the conference's highlights. Years from now, when legal scholars and civil rights historians look back at the fight for voting rights in the 2022, they will almost certainly reference the day Jasmine Crockett stood up to Judge Edward Chen in a San Francisco courtroom. Not because it was the biggest case or the most legally complex, but because it captured something essential about the ongoing struggle for equality in America. The confrontation demonstrated that progress often comes from unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a young black woman from Texas refusing to be silenced to remind a powerful federal judge of the values he once held dear. Sometimes it takes someone with the courage to speak truth to power, even when that power comes with a gavel and a lifetime appointment. But just as importantly, the incident showed that people can change. Judge Chen could have dug in his heels, could have used his position to punish Crockett for her defiance, could have let his ego prevent him from hearing what she had to say. Instead, he chose humility. He chose to listen. He chose to grow. That combination, courage from below and humility from above, is often what it takes to move society forward. The civil rights movement succeeded not just because brave people stood up to power, but because some of those in power had the wisdom to listen when challenged. While Judge Chen's decision was a significant victory, the fight for voting rights continues. Texas appealed the decision, and similar battles are being waged in courtrooms across the country. New restrictions keep appearing, requiring constant vigilance and renewed courage from activists, attorneys, and elected officials like Representative Crockett, Mrs. Jefferson, the 82-year-old grandmother who had been turned away from voting, lived to see Judge Chen's decision. In a small ceremony organized by local activists, she was finally able to cast her ballot again. When a reporter asked her what it felt like, she simply said, "Like America remembered I exist." Marcus Williams, the college student who had struggled to vote, graduated and became a voting rights organizer himself. He traveled to campuses across Texas, sharing his story and helping other young people navigate the complex rules designed to discourage their participation. The single mother who lost her job trying to get a voter ID found new employment and became an advocate for paid time off to vote. She testified before the Texas legislature, and while her proposal hasn't passed yet, the conversation has begun. These stories and thousands like them are why Representative Crockett refused to be silenced that day in court. Behind every statistic, every legal argument, every constitutional principle are real people whose voices matter, whose votes count, whose dignity deserves protection. The story of Judge Chen and Representative Crockett offers several powerful lessons for anyone fighting for justice in today's America. First, expertise and preparation matter. Crockett wasn't effective just because she was passionate. She was effective because she came armed with facts, data, legal precedent, and specific examples. Her years as a civil rights attorney gave her the credibility and knowledge to stand toe-to-toe with a federal judge. Second, courage requires knowing when to push and when to pull back. Crockett challenged Judge Chen's authority, but she never disrespected the court itself. She was firm but professional, passionate but measured. She understood that effective advocacy means walking a fine line between being too deferential and being unnecessarily confrontational. Third, personal stories matter. All the statistics in the world couldn't match the power of Crockett talking about her grandmother or describing Mrs. Jefferson's tears. Human beings respond to human stories, and sometimes the most compelling legal argument is simply showing the face of injustice. Fourth, people in power can change. Judge Chen didn't have to apologize. He didn't have to acknowledge that he had been wrong. He didn't have to write an opinion that so clearly validated Crockett's testimony. But he did all of those things because he had the humility to admit when he had lost his way. Finally, the fight for justice is never really over. Judge Chen's decision was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the story. The case was appealed. New restrictions appeared. The battle continues. That's not a reason for despair. It's simply the reality of living in a democracy where competing visions of justice are constantly in tension. The confrontation between Judge Edward Chen and Representative Jasmine Crockett lasted less than 10 minutes of a day-long hearing. But those 10 minutes revealed something profound about the state of American democracy and the people fighting to preserve it. It showed that courage still matters, that speaking truth to power can make a difference, that expertise and preparation are force multipliers for passion, and that even those in positions of great authority can be moved by honest testimony about injustice. More importantly, it demonstrated that the arc of the moral universe, while long, does indeed bend toward justice, but only when people like Jasmine Crockett grab hold of that arc and pull with all their strength, refusing to let go no matter how hard the powers that be try to shake them loose. Judge Chen's face in that moment after Crockett's reply said it all. It showed surprise, recognition, shame, respect, and ultimately, transformation. It was the face of someone who had been reminded of something important they had forgotten, someone who had been given a gift they didn't know they needed. That gift was the truth. Not the abstract, academic truth found in law books, but the living, breathing truth of people whose voices deserve to be heard, whose votes deserve to be counted, whose dignity demands to be recognized. In the end, that's what democracy requires. People willing to speak that truth, and people in power willing to hear it. The story of Judge Chen and Representative Crockett reminds us that both are possible, even in our polarized and contentious times. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something about courage and justice in America, make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the real stories behind the headlines, the moments that matter, and the people who are fighting every day to make America live up to its highest ideals. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of courage, conviction, and change. Thanks for watching, and remember, your voice matters. Use it.